The smoke rising from Grid Alpha 79er wasn't supposed to be black. Intelligence had classified the valley as pacified, another green zone in a war that supposedly had no more red ones. But smoke doesn't lie, and the thick, oily columns clawing at the Afghan sky told Staff Sergeant Marcus Bull Rodriguez everything he needed to know about how wrong intelligence could be. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened mud as he pressed the radio handset against his ear, static crackling like distant gunfire. "Overlord, this is Sabre 6. We've got eyes on the crash site. One bird down, repeat, one bird down." The words felt heavy in the thin mountain air, each syllable carrying the weight of 14 souls somewhere in that burning valley below. The U-60 Black Hawk had been ferrying a medical team to forward operating base Granite when it simply vanished from radar. No mayday call, no emergency beacon, just the sudden absence of a green dot on a screen 200 miles away. Now Rodriguez could see why. The helicopter lay crumpled against the valley floor like a broken insect, its rotor blades scattered across the rocks like metallic prayer flags. "Overlord copies, Sabre 6. What's your assessment for casualty evacuation?" Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and studied the terrain through the morning haze. The valley was a tactical nightmare: steep walls, limited egress routes, and enough dead space to hide a battalion. Worse, the crash site sat in a bowl surrounded by ridgelines that offered perfect fields of fire for anyone with ill intentions. The Taliban might have been defeated on paper, but paper didn't stop bullets. "Overlord, we're looking at a hot LZ. Gonna need air support before any birds venture down there." He paused, watching a tendril of smoke twist skyward. "And we're gonna need someone crazy enough to thread the needle." The response crackled back immediately. "Sabre 6, negative on air support. Weather front moving in from the west, ceiling dropping fast. No pilot would risk it in these conditions." Rodriguez felt his jaw tight. 14 people were down there, possibly alive, definitely dying if left alone. The sergeant had seen enough wars to know that sometimes headquarters made decisions based on acceptable losses rather than possible miracles. But he'd also seen enough wars to know that miracles had a way of wearing flight suits and carrying call signs that sounded more like poetry than protocol. He keyed the radio again, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd already buried too many friends. "Overlord, request immediate tasking of any available close air support. We've got Americans down there." The static seemed to pause, as if the radio itself understood the gravity of what he was asking. Then, cutting through the white noise like a blade through silk, came a voice that would change everything about the next 6 hours. The transmission was brief, professional, and carried the kind of quiet confidence that made seasoned soldiers pay attention. "Overlord, this is Reaper 27. I've got eyes on the weather and I've got fuel to burn. Rodriguez sounds like he needs some help." In the command center at Bagram Air Base, Major Patricia Henley looked up from her tactical display with raised eyebrows. The voice belonged to Captain Avery "Ghost" Blackwood, and Ghost had a reputation for showing up where angels feared to tread. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II was currently orbiting 30 miles southwest, officially assigned to a routine patrol that had turned routine in the way that military operations never actually stayed routine. "Reaper 27 negative," came the immediate response from Overlord. "Weather is dropping below minimums. Return to base." But Ghost was already banking her warthog toward the smoke, her eyes scanning the heads-up display that painted the world in shades of green and amber. The A-10 was ugly in the way that effective weapons often were: a bathtub surrounded by armor, built around a cannon that could chew through tank armor like paper. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but it was exactly what 14 people in a burning valley needed. "Overlord, Reaper 27 is declaring emergency authority." Ghost's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "I have visual on the crash site and souls on board requiring immediate assistance." The radio fell silent for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Finally, Overlord's voice returned, tight with resignation. Reaper 27, you are cleared for reconnaissance only. Do not repeat, do not engage without direct authorization. Ghost smiled grimly as she pushed the throttles forward. Reconnaissance was just another word for getting close enough to see what needed killing. And if 14 years of flying had taught her anything, it was that sometimes you had to bend the rules to serve the mission. The A-10 descended through the thickening clouds like a predator diving toward prey, its twin engines humming a song of approaching salvation. Rodriguez felt the radio crackle again, and this time the voice carried a note of something he couldn't quite identify, not quite hope, but something close to it. Sabre 6, this is Reaper 27. I'm 2 minutes out from your position. Can you give me a target assessment? The question hung in the static-filled air like a challenge. Rodriguez had worked with close air support before, but never under conditions like these. The valley was socked in with weather, the crash site was potentially hostile, and somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of command, people were probably having conversations about acceptable risk and mission parameters. But Ghost Blackwood wasn't asking about risk assessments or mission parameters. She was asking what needed to be done to bring those 14 people home. Rodriguez keyed his radio with fingers that had forgotten how to shake. Reaper 27, I've got possible survivors at the crash site, but we can't get close enough for positive identification. Too much smoke, and the ridgelines could be crawling with bad actors. Copy that, Sabre 6, stand by. The A-10 dropped through the cloud layer like a gray ghost materializing from the morning mist. Ghost's hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of someone who had turned flying into an art form, adjusting for wind shear and visibility that would have sent lesser pilots scrambling for altitude. The Warthog's distinctive twin-engine whine echoed off the valley walls, a sound that had become synonymous with salvation for ground troops across 2 decades of war. Through her canopy, Ghost could see the crash site clearly now. The Black Hawk lay twisted against the rocks, its fuselage cracked open like an egg. But there was movement near the wreckage, small figures that might have been survivors attempting to signal, or might have been something else entirely. She activated her targeting pod, the high-resolution camera swiveling to focus on the valley floor. The image that appeared on her display made her breath catch. Definitely survivors, at least 3 moving figures near the helicopter, and what looked like improvised medical care happening in the shadow of the wreckage. But there was something else. Movement on the ridgelines, the kind of disciplined positioning that didn't happen by accident. Sabre 6, Reaper 27. I count 3 possible survivors at the crash site, but you've got company on the high ground. Multiple positions, looks like they've been waiting for someone to show up. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. An ambush then. Classic Taliban tactics, let the Americans crash, wait for the rescue attempt, then kill everyone who came to help. It was the kind of trap that had claimed too many good people over the years. Reaper 27, can you engage the positions? Ghost studied her displays, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of someone who had done this dance too many times. The enemy positions were well concealed, probably reinforced, and dangerously close to the crash survivors. One wrong move and the rescue would become a massacre. Sabre 6, it's going to be surgical. I need you to mark the crash site with smoke so I know where not to shoot. The request was simple, but both soldiers understood what it really meant. Ghost was about to thread a needle at 300 miles per hour, in bad weather, with people's lives hanging in the balance. And she was going to do it alone, because no one else was crazy enough to try. Rodriguez pulled a smoke grenade from his tactical vest, his hand steady despite everything his mind was telling him about the stupidity of what they were attempting. Reaper 27, purple smoke going out now. The grenade arced through the air and landed 20 meters from the crashed helicopter, immediately beginning to pour violet-colored smoke into the valley. Ghost locked the position into her navigation system and began her attack run, the A-10's cannon already spinning up to firing speed. What happened next would be talked about in ready rooms and briefing halls for years to come. The kind of story that gets better with each telling but never loses its essential truth. Sometimes, when everything goes wrong, the right person shows up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right skills to make it right again. The first pass was pure artistry. Ghost came in low and fast, her cannon stitching a line of 30 destruction across the eastern ridgeline with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The GAU-8 Avenger spoke in its distinctive voice, a deep, mechanical roar that sounded like the world's largest zipper being yanked open. Each round was the size of a milk bottle, designed to kill tanks, and the effect on human targets was immediate and devastating. The enemy positions that had been invisible moments before suddenly revealed themselves in the most final way possible, muzzle flashes winking out like stars at dawn, as Ghost's cannon found its marks. She pulled up hard, banking left to avoid the valley walls, already calculating the geometry for her second pass. Sabre 6, eastern ridgeline is neutralized. I'm coming around for the west side. Rodriguez watched through his binoculars as the A-10 carved through the sky with lethal grace. Ghost flew like someone who had been born to this, her aircraft responding to her touch like an extension of her will. The Warthog wasn't built for elegance, but in her hands it moved with the fluid precision of a dancer who happened to carry enough firepower to level city blocks. The second pass was even more impressive than the first. Ghost came in at a different angle, using the valley's topography to mask her approach until the last possible second. The western positions had maybe 3 seconds of warning before her cannon turned their concealment into kindling, and their tactical advantage into ancient history. Sabre 6, both ridgelines are clear. You're good to move. But even as Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission, Ghost was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Clearing the immediate threat was only the beginning. Now came the hard part. 14 people needed medical evacuation from a valley that was still socked in with weather, and the nearest medevac birds were grounded until conditions improved. Unless, of course, someone was willing to do something unprecedented. Ghost had been flying the A-10 for 8 years, ever since graduating from flight school with honors that nobody expected from a farm girl from Nebraska. The Warthog was a single-seat aircraft, designed for one mission, killing enemy armor. It had no provisions for carrying passengers, no medical equipment, no rescue capacity whatsoever. But it did have something else. A pilot who had grown up fixing tractors with her grandfather. Someone who understood that sometimes you had to make tools do things they weren't designed for. Overlord, this is Reaper 27. I'm declaring emergency authority for field modification procedures. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when seasoned military professionals realize that someone is about to attempt something that exists in the gray area between brilliant and insane. Reaper 27, say again. Ghost was already descending toward the valley floor, her eyes scanning for the flattest piece of ground within reasonable distance of the crash site. Overlord, I'm going to attempt field evacuation of the wounded. I need you to scramble every available bird to my position for follow-on medevac. Negative, Reaper 27. The A-10 is not certified for passenger transport. Copy that, Overlord, but it's about to be. What Ghost Blackwood did next would be studied in military academies, analyzed by safety boards, and remembered by the families of 14 people who came home when they shouldn't have. She set her A-10 down on a patch of rocky ground that was barely wide enough for the aircraft's landing gear, using every trick she'd learned about short-field operations, and a few she invented on the spot. The touchdown was perfect, firm but controlled, the aircraft settling onto the makeshift landing strip like it had been designed for exactly this purpose. Ghost shut down one engine to conserve fuel, but kept the other spooling to maintain electrical power and hydraulics. Time was everything now. Rodriguez and his team reached the crashed helicopter within minutes, finding a scene that was both better and worse than they'd feared. 3 crew members were alive but badly injured, along with 2 members of the medical team they'd been transporting. The rest had died in the initial crash, their bodies already being prepared for transport by the survivors with the grim efficiency of people who had seen too much war. The wounded were in bad shape: broken bones, internal injuries, severe burns from the post-crash fire. Under normal circumstances, they would need immediate helicopter evacuation to a trauma center with full medical support during transport. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Ghost Blackwood had never been accused of being a normal pilot. She had already begun modifying her aircraft with the kind of battlefield improvisation that would have made MacGyver proud. The A-10's cockpit was designed for one person, but the area behind the pilot's seat could accommodate additional weight if you were willing to get creative with safety regulations and common sense. Working with Rodriguez and his medics, Ghost removed everything from the cockpit that wasn't essential: survival gear, extra ammunition, even her ejection seat cushions. Every pound mattered when you were trying to turn a single-seat attack aircraft into an impromptu ambulance. The most seriously wounded survivor was Staff Sergeant Jennifer Torres, a flight medic who had sustained multiple fractures and possible internal bleeding when the helicopter went down. Under normal protocols, moving her without proper spinal immobilization would be criminally negligent. But leaving her in a valley that was crawling with Taliban reinforcements would be criminally fatal. Ghost looked Torres in the eye as they prepared to move her into the aircraft. "Sergeant, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to hurt, and there's a good chance we're all about to do something that breaks every rule in the book. But if you want to see your kids again, this is your ride." Torres managed a weak smile through her pain medication. "Ma'am, I've flown with worse pilots in better aircraft. Let's go home." The first evacuation flight was a masterpiece of controlled desperation. Ghost strapped Torres into the space behind her seat using every available restraint, padding the improvised stretcher with her own flight suit and anything else that might provide cushioning. The takeoff was gentle by A-10 standards, but still brutal for someone with broken ribs and possible spinal injuries. But it worked. 23 minutes later, Ghost set down at Forward Operating Base Granite, where a full medical team was waiting to take over Torres' care. The flight medic was conscious, stable, and very much alive. "Reaper 27, that was some flying," came the transmission from the base tower. Ghost was already preparing for her second trip. "Tower, I need fuel and I need it fast. I've got 4 more people to bring home." The second and third evacuation flights followed the same pattern: careful preparation, improvised medical support, and flying that pushed the boundaries of what the A-10 was capable of. Each time, Ghost managed to coax her aircraft into performing a mission it was never designed for, carrying wounded soldiers to safety with the kind of precision that made hardened ground troops believe in miracles again. By the time the weather cleared enough for proper medevac helicopters to reach the valley, Ghost had evacuated all 5 survivors and recovered the bodies of the 9 soldiers who hadn't made it. Her A-10 had logged 4 hours of flight time in conditions that should have grounded every aircraft in theater, and performed 5 landings on terrain that wasn't suitable for tricycles, much less combat aircraft. The after-action reports would eventually fill 3 file cabinets, but the only statistic that mattered was written in the base's daily log: 0 additional casualties during recovery operations. That night in the officers' club at Bagram, Ghost Blackwood sat alone at the bar, nursing a beer and trying not to think about how close things had come to going completely sideways. She'd been flying combat missions for 3 years, but today felt different. Today felt like the kind of day that changes how you see everything that comes after. "You know, most people would call what you did today impossible." Ghost looked up to find Major Henley standing beside her table, holding two beers and wearing the kind of expression that senior officers get when they're trying to figure out whether to court-martial someone or recommend them for a medal. "Most people don't fly A-10s, ma'am." Henley sat down and slid one of the beers across the table. "Mind if I ask you something, Captain? What made you think you could pull off something like that?" Ghost was quiet for a long moment, staring at the beer bottle as if it might contain the answer to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every person she'd ever lost and every person she'd managed to save. "My grandfather used to tell me that tools don't care what they were designed for. They only care what you're willing to make them do." She took a sip of beer and met Henley's eyes. "Today, I needed my airplane to be an ambulance, so that's what it became." The conversation that followed would eventually lead to changes in doctrine, modifications to aircraft, and new training protocols for pilots operating in contested environments. But at that moment, it was just two soldiers sharing a drink and trying to make sense of a day that had started with 14 people in trouble and ended with 5 people going home to their families. Outside the officers' club, the Afghan night was clear and cold, stars visible for the first time in days. Somewhere in that darkness, Taliban fighters were probably regrouping, planning new attacks, adapting their tactics to account for pilots who were willing to land attack aircraft in hostile valleys to save wounded soldiers. Let them adapt, Ghost thought. She'd be ready. The next morning brought the kind of bureaucratic storm that always follows when someone bends the rules hard enough to save lives. Ghost found herself sitting across from a review board that included everyone from flight surgeons to legal officers, all of them very interested in discussing the finer points of aircraft modification procedures and emergency authority declarations. "Captain Blackwood," began Colonel Morrison, the board's senior member, "are you aware that what you did yesterday violated approximately 14 different safety regulations?" "Yes, sir." "Are you also aware that it violated several international aviation treaties regarding military aircraft modification?" "Yes, sir." Morrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Captain, in your professional opinion, would you do it again?" Ghost met his gaze without flinching. She'd been expecting this question since the moment she decided to land her A-10 in a hostile valley, and she'd already decided on her answer. "Sir, if American soldiers are dying and I have the capability to save them, then yes, I would do it again, every time." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room realizes they're dealing with someone who has made peace with the consequences of their choices. Morrison shuffled through the papers in front of him, taking his time with whatever decision was crystallizing behind his measured expression. "Captain Blackwood, this board finds that your actions, while technically in violation of multiple regulations, were consistent with the highest traditions of military service and the moral imperatives of the soldier's creed." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Furthermore, this board recommends that you be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight." Ghost felt something tight in her chest finally release. She'd been prepared for court-martial proceedings, career-ending reprimands, maybe even civilian prosecution for reckless endangerment. Instead, she was getting recognition for doing what any pilot worth their wings would have done in the same situation. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Captain. Along with the medal comes a new assignment. Headquarters wants you to help develop new protocols for combat search and rescue operations. Seems they think your particular brand of creative problem-solving might be useful for training other pilots." The assignment would take Ghost back to the United States to test pilot schools and training commands where her experience could be distilled into doctrine and taught to the next generation of combat aviators. It was the kind of career opportunity that most pilots dreamed about: prestigious, safe, and guaranteed to look good on promotion boards. But as Ghost walked out of the hearing room, she found herself thinking about Rodriguez and his team, still out there in the mountains, still finding themselves in situations where the rulebook didn't have answers and someone needed to make the hard choices. She thought about Staff Sergeant Tors, recovering in a hospital bed in Germany, alive because someone had been willing to turn an attack aircraft into an ambulance. She thought about the other survivors, the ones who would go home to their families, because a pilot from Nebraska had decided that tools don't care what they were designed for. Most of all, she thought about the 9 soldiers they hadn't been able to save, and the weight that every combat pilot carries. The knowledge that no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you try, sometimes the math just doesn't work out in your favor. 3 days later, Ghost Blackwood climbed into her A-10 for what would be her final combat mission in Afghanistan. The aircraft had been fully inspected and returned to standard configuration, all traces of her improvised medical modifications removed by maintenance crews who worked with the kind of professional discretion that keeps militaries functioning despite the creative interpretations of regulations by their most effective members. But as she ran through her pre-flight checklist, Ghost could still see the scratches on the cockpit floor where they'd bolted down improvised stretcher brackets. She could still smell the lingering antiseptic smell of medical supplies that had been crammed into every available space. The airplane remembered what it had been asked to do, even if the maintenance records would never reflect it. Her final mission was routine patrol, the kind of flight that had become standard during the drawdown of American forces. Ghost flew her assigned route with professional competence, checking in with ground units, monitoring radio traffic, maintaining the kind of aerial presence that reminded everyone, friendly and hostile, that American air power was still a factor in the equation. But her mind kept drifting to a conversation she'd had with Tors before the wounded medic was evacuated to Germany. They'd talked about the nature of service, about the difference between following orders and fulfilling the deeper mission that brought people into uniform in the first place. "You know what I realized," Tors had said through her morphine haze. "We spend so much time worrying about whether we're following the right procedures that we forget to ask whether we're doing the right thing." It was a distinction that would define the rest of Ghost's career, and the careers of the pilots she would eventually train. The difference between compliance and effectiveness, between following regulations and serving the deeper purpose that regulations were supposed to support. As Ghost brought her A-10 home for the last time, she knew that her war was ending but her service was just beginning. Somewhere back in the United States, there were young pilots learning to fly, preparing for their own deployments, their own moments when the rulebook wouldn't have answers and they'd have to decide what kind of officer they wanted to be. She would be ready to teach them, not just about flying, but about the weight of choices and the mathematics of sacrifice, about the difference between what aircraft were designed to do and what they could be made to do when the mission demanded it, about the moment when a pilot stops asking permission and starts taking responsibility. The A-10 touched down at Bagram for the final time with Ghost Blackwood at the controls, its twin engines winding down with the satisfied sigh of a machine that had been pushed to its limits and found them to be more flexible than anyone had imagined. As she shut down the systems and completed her post-flight paperwork, Ghost reflected on the strange career path that had brought a farm girl from Nebraska to this particular moment in this particular war. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her that tools don't care what they were designed for, and her flight instructor, who had told her that the best pilots were the ones who could make the impossible look routine. She thought about Rodriguez and his team, still out there in the mountains, and Tors, recovering in a hospital bed thousands of miles away. Most of all, she thought about the future, about the pilots who would come after her, the missions they would fly, the choices they would have to make when the manual didn't have answers and people's lives hung in the balance. Ghost Blackwood had learned to fly because she loved the freedom of the sky. She had become a combat pilot because she believed in service. But she had become a legend because she understood that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that don't officially exist, carried out by people who are willing to risk everything for the chance to bring their fellow soldiers home. Years later, when young pilots asked her about that day in Afghanistan, Ghost would tell them that the hardest part wasn't the flying or the improvised medical procedures or even the bureaucratic aftermath. The hardest part was the moment of decision, the instant when she had to choose between following orders and following her conscience. The airplane will do whatever you ask it to do, she would tell them. The question is, are you asking it to do the right thing? It was a question that would echo through flight training programs and officer development courses, carried by instructors who understood that teaching people to fly was only half the job. The other half was teaching them to think, to choose, to take responsibility for the consequences of their decisions, even when those decisions fell outside the neat boundaries of regulation and protocol. In the end, that might have been Ghost Blackwood's greatest contribution to military aviation, not the lives she saved or the medals she earned, but the example she set for everyone who came after. The demonstration that sometimes, when the stakes are high enough and the need is great enough, the right choice is to stop asking what's allowed and start asking what's necessary. The sky, after all, doesn't care about regulations. It only cares about the people brave enough to claim it.